know Michael. I have the honor to give the opening remarks and some opening notes about this symposium. And the themes will be introduced and the subject matter will be introduced by Charles Moll. I had the great pleasure and honor to meet Charles about 5 years ago in Israel at the Vidal Sassoon Center, where we both engaged in the study of anti-Semitism. And hereafter I came and joined this community. Charles is Canadian. He received his academic training in Canada, basically in Montreal, at the beginning in McGill University. Later on he went to the UK, and the best address in the UK is Oxford, and he was not only there, he has his PhD from Oxford, so this is a statement in itself. Hereafter he was involved in research and also teaching in Canada as well as in Israel. And since the foundation of this center, YIISA, Interdisciplinary Initiative for the Study of Anti-Semitism, his institution has become internationally well known, attached to the big fame of Yale, and also to his personality, and also to the fellows he selected. And you have, I mean, the fellows who are attending, you face a great challenge, yeah. And we have, I mean, I joined Charles thinking the research you are doing, yeah, and this will be hopefully published soon. And so you are the face of YIISA. And YIISA is becoming one of the international centers for the study of anti-Semitism. And the leader is Charles Moll, and I join him. I'm a Muslim, he's a Jew, so we have a Jewish Islamic Alliance for countering anti-Semitism. And as one Muslim leader, the president of Senegal, recently at the meeting of UNESCO stated, anti-Semitism is a crime against humanity, and so countering crimes, fighting crimes, should be a Jewish Islamic undertaking to make it more successful. There will be also a volume forthcoming soon. We had at YIISA a very distinguished lectures with high caliber speakers, top guns in the field, and all of these top guns will be contributors to a volume to be edited by Charles soon, to be published by Yale University Press. I very much look forward to a successful meeting and intellectual exchange, and I hope, Charles is not only the director, he is also the intellectual leader, and he would lead us into the theme to be discussed in more details in the presentations later on. Please, Charles.
Thank you very much, Bassam. So it's great that we're here today to discuss, I think, a very important and urgent subject. The title of today's seminar or conference is Understanding Facets of Contemporary Antisemitism. And I think the emphasis is and ought to be on contemporary antisemitism. As you know, we're one of 4 research centers in the entire world dealing with antisemitism. We're the newest, and perhaps of the 4, we're the one that's placing more emphasis on the contemporary context. And I think if I could pick up what Bassam has been saying in his lectures earlier in the week and in his introduction, and also picking up on what Yossi Klein-Halevi said last night, is that there has been a shift in the challenge of facing anti-Semitism. And whether you hear the work of Bassam or what Yossi Klein-Halevi said last night, that there was a shift in 2000 with the rise of the Second Intifada from a sort of a nationalist-based uprising or struggle against Israel from a nationalist perspective, from a material perspective. There's been a shift, at least from 2000, to a jihadist perspective. Benny Morris is now arguing that it's been a jihadist perspective perhaps all along, at least since 1948. So whether it's 1948 or 2000, the world has changed, and I think the world is changing rapidly and radically, economically, socially, culturally, politically, through globalization, through the challenges of globalization, the processes of globalization, and I think the facets and the processes associated with anti-Semitism is also shifting dramatically. And I think the old perspectives and the old tools for understanding anti-Semitism may be as antiquated as understanding the world through the lens of the Cold War or through other lenses that are from the past. And I think this is the challenge of scholarship. And I think, as I said yesterday, that during Benny's presentation, that Henri Bernard Levy says that the role of a scholar is to shed light or to shine light where there's darkness. And I think that those of us who are engaged in the study of anti-Semitism have to be engaged as scholars at the highest caliber, at the highest intellectual caliber, and at the same time to be engaged in the world and to be practical. That the challenges facing these issues are profound, they have policy implications, and that we cannot just be simply in the ivory tower navel gazing. There's a responsibility to also be engaged in the world in a very real way. And this is the challenge, and this is the challenge perhaps of scholarship in general. But in a sense, I think within the study of contemporary anti-Semitism, we can't afford to be detached entirely. And if you look at Jewish ethics, for example, it's actually for the scholar to be detached from the community, detached from reality. It's actually considered to be a sin. That once you acquire knowledge and wisdom and understanding of the reality, and you turn your back on the reality, on the community, or on the issues of the day, with an understanding, it's more of a transgression, if you will, than if you sit detached in an ignorant fashion. And what Bassam was saying is that I was privileged to be at UNESCO last Friday, a week ago, where Project Aladdin was, Aladdin was launched, and it's a fascinating project. They have a website that you can go to where people throughout an international coalition of people are engaged in trying to bring Holocaust education to the Muslim world. And there were about 3,000 people at UNESCO for this launch of this project. And it's basically translating important texts on the Shoah into Arabic, into Persian, into Farsi, and disseminating it through the Arab world. And in the words of the president of Senegal, who's a Muslim African leader, I think it was the first time I've seen a non-Jewish political leader from a perspective from within the Muslim world say something so direct and so profoundly true. He basically said, this is President Wade, he basically said that this Holocaust denial, which is running through the world and is being being plugged in by radical Islamists as a form of an attack on Israel and the Jewish community. But what they said is that Holocaust denial is a war against the Jews, and that there's a war against the Jews. And he said it exactly like that. And then he went on to say that a war against the Jews is a war against humanity. And for him to say it, it was in the halls of UNESCO, of all places, was, I think, at some level profound. And it is a war on humanity, because as we know, when there's a war against the Jews, when anti-Semitism starts to spread, as it is, it starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And once it starts with the Jews, the next, it usually migrates like a disease to other elements of the society, and it usually starts to target other marginal groups or disenfranchised groups or groups that are somewhat weak in society, like other religious minorities or other minorities, women, gay people. The notion of democracy, that there's an assault on, I would even say, and I would go so far as saying, an assault on civilization. And that this is a movement, a social movement, which is beginning to find traction in too many places in the world. What was also interesting, after what they spoke, Jacques Chirac, the former president of France, spoke. And what he said was, I think, equally profound, but I would say from a very negative perspective. He got up and he spoke about the 85,000 Jews who were deported from France during the Vichy government, in which only 2,300 returned. The rest were exterminated in the camps of Nazi Germany, Nazi Europe. 2,300 people, 2,350 odd people returned. The 82,500 were massacred in the camps. And what he said is that he was speaking about the French responsibility of the Holocaust, and this is relatively, amazingly so, a relatively new development in the French political and cultural scene, that the French establishment actually took responsibility for their role in the Holocaust. And he was sort of reiterating that, and he was a part of the, the first, I think Mitterrand was the first person to, the first head of state to admit it, and Jacques Chirac, when he was president, pushed this along further, taking French responsibility. But he was basically saying that the French society under the Vichy government sided with the Vichy government and the pro-Nazi government because of fear. And he spoke about fear as, I would even say, as a moral and ethical excuse for what the French did during World War II and during the Shoah. And it was profound. So here you have an African Muslim leader saying the war on the Jews is a war on humanity, and that there is a war on the Jews going on right now. And he was very clear and very strong. Chirac gets up and says that we were operating out of fear. And isn't it ironic, and isn't it true, that there's such fear to confront anti-Semitism? And we're going to be holding another conference at the end of the month on notions of denial and paralysis. And we're having psychological, psychiatric experts, professors of psychology and psychiatry come to deal with the notions of denial and paralysis when it comes to genocidal anti-Semitism. And is it out of fear that there is this inability to act, this inability to see straight and to analyze in a very clear interdisciplinary perspective of what is going on? What are the processes of anti-Semitism? Why is there this denial? Why is there this paralysis? Why is there this fear gripping intelligent, educated scholars, human rights activists, politicians, policymakers? Why is there this fear to stand up against people and the social movement and an ideology which is filling a vacuum, a political, economic, and cultural vacuum in so many and too many societies? Why this denial? Why not only this denial, but why a selling out of our principles? If you believe in democracy, in social democracy, in notions of equality, citizenship, social justice, how is it possible that scholars at Yale University, scholars throughout the best universities in the Western world, from Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, the Ivy League, that people are actually advocating the enfranchisement of groups that believe in genocidal anti-Semitism, that groups that advocate the murdering and dismembering of homosexuals, the subjugation of women, the doing away with freedom of worship? How can we sell out our principles in the face of this social movement which is threatening too many societies, and now I would even say threatening our own basic principles of democracy and justice and equality? Last year, Elie Wiesel came to Yale. He spoke at the Yale Law School, and he spoke about the possibility of another Holocaust. And for me, watching Elie Wiesel in his lifetime, roughly an 80-year-old man, given the education that he's been engaged in as sharing his experience of the Shoah, educating people on the Shoah, and trying, I think, in the best of Jewish ethics and morality, trying to teach people to bridge the gap between witnessing an injustice and doing something about it. That we can't be inactive when in the face of injustice, and that this is perhaps the essence of Pirkei Avot in Jewish ethics. And Elie Wiesel was, I think, spent his whole life trying to get people, if it's about anti-Semitism or the Shoah, or issues of Rwanda, South Africa, Bosnia, all the issues that he's been engaged in, it's always about trying to get people to act in the face of injustice and not to be bystanders. So Elie Wiesel, in his lifetime, here he was speaking about the possibility of another Holocaust, and I found this to be such an indignity that he had to say this in his lifetime. And he went on to speak, and if this wasn't enough, he said that the thing that really bothers him, as if it wasn't enough that there's a possibility of another Holocaust, he said the thing that really bothers him is that people are not doing anything about it. That the American Jewish community is not doing enough. The intellectual and academic and scholar community is not doing enough. Students are not doing enough. Where are the students? I remember being a student in the 80s and 90s and dealing with issues of the struggle for Soviet Jewry, the issues of apartheid, the issues of racism, of indigenous native issues in Canada. Students were engaged. And where are the students? Where are the intellectual leaders when it comes to this face of fear? I also had the privilege of meeting Natan Sharansky a few months ago in Israel. And actually I was involved in the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, and I met his family in Moscow. They came to meet me and a friend from Montreal in sort of incognito. They came to an apartment. It was a whole meeting. And when Sharansky, this was a time when Sharansky was in a hunger strike in a Soviet prison, and this is sort of the darkest time in his imprisonment. When we met in Israel a few months ago, he said that during this time that he knew he would be free, and that he was in solitary confinement on a hunger strike, but he knew one day he'd be walking free in Jerusalem. He knew it in his heart. And he said he knew it in his heart because, as he put it, and I'm using his words, housewives and students were marching in the streets by hundreds of thousands of people, and that he knew he'd be free. And he said to me, he said, Charles, why is there such a silence in the academic community? Where is the students? Where's the Jewish leadership? Where are the human rights activists? Where are the people who care about women's rights, gay rights, notions of democracy? Where are they? Why the silence? And I don't quite have an answer. And I think to pick up on some of the issues, as you know, I've been traveling a lot, and I've been speaking and most recently at several universities in the United States and in Canada during the apartheid week. And as a young student in my days in England and Canada, I was the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada. I was engaged in the anti-apartheid movement, and for all sorts of reasons somehow became among the leadership of the international struggle against apartheid. And I engaged in the struggle and was very proud and happy to be part of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee and the sort of international effort to isolate the apartheid regime. Because on the one hand, apartheid to me represented the most repugnant form of racism. Its ideology was rooted in a Nazi fascist-like racist view of the world, which was repugnant. It segregated people at all levels of society and treated people, the vast majority of South African people, as subhuman and disenfranchised. And this was something that I think everybody at the time had to and ought to have spoken out against. But I was engaged in the anti-apartheid movement because the South African anti-apartheid movement had at its core the South African, it was called the South African Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter, you can read, is basically roughly, with some perhaps a few inconsistencies, it was basically a social democratic blueprint. It talked about eliminating the apartheid regime and replacing it with a democracy, and enfranchising everybody to be equal citizens regardless of race and religion and gender and political view and ethnicity and all that sort of thing, and to create a non-racial, free South African society. And as a scholar, as a Canadian Jewish person, if you will, this is something that I believed very strongly in and was honored to be a part of the struggle. 15, 20 years later, we have on campuses an anti-apartheid movement which is spreading like wildfire, emerging throughout parts of Western Europe, North America, and now even South America and parts of Africa. This effort to delegitimize and demonize Israel in the most repugnant way. It's a movement that is not only filled with lies, it's filled with hatred. And I was at York University, and amazingly, the people engaged in the Anti-Apartheid Week had a rally and stormed the Hillel on campus at York University and held, middle-class Canadian kids hostage for 8 hours in the student Hillel building. And were hundreds of people chanting, kill the Jews, Jews out of Israel, Jews out of Canada, Jews out of York University. And the response of the administration of York University was actually to issue a fine, a penalty to Hillel, the Jewish student union, for the people that were being held hostage, because apparently they had a table with pamphlets that violated some bylaw of York University, and the president of Hillel, the student of Hillel, the student leader, was fined $150. The students and the people from off campus who were yelling death threats and held students hostage for 8 hours. It took 4 hours for police to enter into the Hillel, and then the police were too terrified to walk the kids out of the Hillel because of the mob was so out of control. And the students who were issuing death threats and holding students hostages were never, to this day, held accountable. So there's a movement which is infused, and I think either explicitly or through, or tacitly, if you will, that this anti-apartheid movement, in a sense, by demonizing Israel without looking at things in a balanced perspective, and that's not to say that you can't criticize Israel, of course you can criticize Israel on many levels, but to demonize, to misrepresent Israel, and at the same time, through acquiescence, I think empower a social movement which is developing in the Middle East, which wants to literally exterminate Jews, to get rid of the state of Israel, to get rid of the Zionist entity, and to kill Jews, literally. And so I've been going around speaking about the South African Freedom Charter and comparing it to the Hamas Charter. And the Hamas Charter, as I think many of you know here, is an incredible document. And it's an incredible document at many levels. First of all, I think it's an honest document. And it honestly reflects the social movement that is sweeping through parts of the Middle East. It's honest in the sense that the Hamas Charter reflects a movement of the most repugnant kind, and it reflects a movement or an ideology that is being supported by the Iranian regime, and the Iranian regime is supporting Hamas ideologically, militarily, economically, as it is Hezbollah. And here you have, in the West, apparently, people who claim to be from the left, people who claim to care about human rights, in a sense, supporting or entering into a red-green coalition in denouncing and attacking Israel. What's amazing with Hamas is that here is a Islamist organization that wants to do away with Western or Crusader or Jewish or Zionist influence in the region and recreate some sort of caliphate and create a Muslim or Islamic Palestinian state and to do away with Jews. And what they do in this quest to eliminate the influences of the West and of the other, they actually use the most repugnant form of European genocidal anti-Semitism, and they take the protocols of the Elders of Zion, imported from Europe, and insert it into its charter, into its founding document. This is not the rantings and ravings of a few lunatics on the fringes of Hamas, or some extreme wing of Hamas, but this is the raison d'etre of the Hamas movement. And they use European anti-Semitism. They don't just mention it in their charter, but it's a theme that's fused throughout, from the beginning of the charter to the end of the charter. You can read the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is infused. And what is amazing, if in the United States there's this freedom of speech and this almost religion of freedom of speech, unlike Canada and other Western European countries, there's limits on hate speech. At least in universities, where plagiarism is perhaps the greatest sin, I think Hamas should be banned from intellectual discussions and from universities, at least on the grounds of plagiarism. But at least if they start to footnote the protocols of the Elders of Zion, maybe they should be allowed back in the universities. But this is the discourse, and what is incredible is that scholars, intelligent people, educated people, don't want to look at this head on in a very serious manner. And this to me is amazing. I don't have so much time, but I was going to speak a little bit about Iran and the threat of Iran. And here too, when it comes to the Iranian threat, and what is important about Iran and radical Islamicism, of course not to be confused with Islam, is the fact that they're straightforward and they're honest. If you read their policies, if you read their constitutions and charters, if you read the speeches coming out of the mosques on Friday, if you read the military policy, they're straightforward and honest. And this you have to give them credit for. They don't mince words. They're straight up and honest. And it's we in the West who for some reason can't look into the abyss and can't face the challenge. I was in Germany recently meeting with some serious policy advisors for political parties and spoke about Ahmadinejad's famous quote during this Holocaust Denial Conference in 2005, which was, the name of the conference was The World Without Zionism. And he said that the establishment of the Zionist regime was a move by the world oppressors against the Islamic world, and that the state of Israel was illegitimate. And he said that, and this is I think the important thing, he always says, as the Imam says, that Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. And yet, when I meet intellectuals and I meet German policymakers, they say that the translation is not appropriate, that the translation is somehow wrong. That it wasn't exactly Israel and it wasn't exactly the regime, but it was something to do with the translation. But if you study the ideology of the Iranian revolutionary regime and the Ayatollahs who run the show, and especially Ahmadinejad's group, you have to at least understand the context. And when I go around speaking, I ask professors and scholars and students, who has read the Hamas Charter? Who has read fatwas? Who has read the history of the Jews in places like Iran and in Persia? And the notion of impurity, which permeates the society for centuries, way before the Zionist movement was even an idea that was considered seriously. That the context, is, in terms of scholarship, we need to understand the context. So Ahmadinejad is a group, is part of a group of people that are, in a sense, very much engaged in this notion of the missing, or the 12th Imam. The 12th Imam is Muhammad al-Mahdi, who was in lineal descent of the Prophet Muhammad, who is said to have gone into a state of acculturation in 874 AD. So according to this legend, the Imam will reappear and usher in a Messianic age. And this is Shiite Islam, and it's not so different in a sense, perhaps, than the Jewish notion of understanding that the Mashiach will come, or a Messiah will come and usher in the Messianic age. But what's different with Ahmadinejad and his group is that they're trying to actively bring about the return of the Imam. So like Jews and most Shiite Muslims, people wait and pray for the return. These people think that they can usher in the era of the return of the Imam. So most Twelvers are quietists, waiting for the arrival, but Ahmadinejad and some of the Ayatollahs who are running Iran believe that they can usher in the new era. That the intellectual figure that these people are following is Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi Mazba Yazdi, and that he was one of the supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, and he is the supporter of the successor supreme leader of Khomeini, and he's the most conservative member of the inner circle of Ayatollahs. And this is the person who's the intellectual leader of the current regime. When Ahmadinejad was elected, the first thing he did is he ordered the creation, he built a $17 million mosque. It was called the Jankaran Mosque, which will house the Mahdi when the Mahdi returns, or when the Mahdi reemerges. He said when Ahmadinejad was elected, the first thing that he said publicly was that the main mission of the Islamic Republic was to bring about the reappearance of the Imam. When Ahmadinejad spoke at the United Nations 3 years ago, he said, and I'm quoting, "I felt the atmosphere suddenly change, And for those 27 or 28 minutes, the leaders of the world did not blink. It seemed as if a hand was holding them there, and it opened their eyes to receive the message of the Islamic Republic. He then went on to say how he thought that the room was bathed in a green light and that nobody was moving, and so on and so forth. So here you have a person on a messianic mission, and he's bringing along with him the regime. And as we know, he's engaged in language which is not just about wiping Israel off the map, as the Imam says. In February of 2008, and what's interesting, I think when he made the statement that Israel be wiped off the map, there was an international outcry. People were outraged at the statement. Most people, although some intellectuals were doing these gymnastics with the translation. But when he said in February of 2008, and I quote, "The world powers established this filthy bacteria, the Zionist regime, which is lashing out at the world like a beast. Israel won the support from other nations, which created it as a scarecrow to control the area within the Islamic world." And he goes on to say these things which are reminiscent to sort of notion of bacteria and that sort of thing, which is reminiscent of another age. But when he said this, there wasn't a public outcry. And the world has become silent. I think as Clemens often says, when Salman Rushdie was issued with the fatwa, the European Union withdrew all of its ambassadors from Tehran out of a sense of protest. When Ahmadinejad continuously incites genocide, and I'm not using this term lightly, I'm using this term in a legal, scholarly way, when he's engaged in incitement to genocide, the world is silent. And where, again, are the intellectual leaders, where are the scholars, and where is the public outcry? So I think these are the issues. So at the one hand, we have a government that is spreading its influence in much of the world, as Catherine Chatterley said here a few weeks ago in one of our seminars. When Ahmadinejad came to the UN in September of 2008, when he was at the General Assembly, he's using the protocols of the Elders of Zion not just to speak to the street in the Islamic world and gain support, but he's now starting to have significant influence in playing on the marginalization in societies beyond the Muslim and the Middle East. In Venezuela, in South Africa, when the Deputy Foreign Minister of South Africa said that the Jews are controlling the United States and its money, 20,000 people cheered wildly. That the themes of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that somehow the Jews are controlling the world, is now permeating and influencing into the non-Islamic world. And this, you want to call it a Red-Green Alliance, or an alliance against the Jews as the symbol of capital, of the symbol of power, of the symbol of corruption, is beginning to gain traction. And yet, on the landscape of academia and scholarship, the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Antisemitism is one of 4 places in the world, and unfortunately we're a small group that's emerging, but we're one of the few places or spaces in the world where we're engaging this issue seriously. Scholarly. Growing. But so in a sense that the sense of urgency, and I think the sense of responsibility of scholars engaged in this issue is profound. And we have to take this into consideration as scholars. And I would even say in the near future, it appears, and it's hard to predict the future, but it would appear that everything is sort of falling into place, that in the next year or two, that these issues are going to become even more urgent. And if there's some sort of confrontation between Israel and Iran, or the West and Iran, whether the Israelis successfully stop or hinder or delay the clear nuclear and weapons program of Iran, that the blowback from that is going to be very significant in terms of the rises of anti-Semitism. We saw the reaction in Europe, for example, to the Gaza operation, the reaction to Gaza a few months ago. There was a tremendous spike in anti-Semitism in Europe. The question would be, what is going to be the reaction if there's an attack or some sort of confrontation with Iran. What is the blowback going to be from that? If it's accompanied by, and it's very possible that there'll be some sort of attacks in Europe or North America as a response to some sort of confrontation with Iran. What will be the public response to this little country in the Middle East dealing with these issues? So I think the threats against Israel is significant. I think the threats against the Jewish communities in the diaspora are also significant, and the processes associated with this are going to be very important. So what is our role as scholars to deal with this emergency, I would say? And so on the one hand, we have to sit in the ivory tower, be detached, think, read, be objective, be scientific. We must do that, and we cannot abandon our role as scholars, as serious scholars, to engage in scholarship. But on the other hand, what do we do if we're the few people engaged in this issue in the contemporary context, which seems to be shifting and changing rapidly? What is our role as intellectuals? What is our responsibility? And I think this is the challenge. And I think that this has to be thought about very carefully and very significant. And I would say, if you go back to I think some of the finest traditions in the Western Academy, if you go back to the notions of Jewish ethics and Pirkei Avot, and other ethics and other cultural contexts, if you will, that there is a responsibility for scholars, particularly people who know, to act. And I think that this is our challenge, and it's a very significant challenge. And we have to also brainstorm about not just understanding, but brainstorm on how to be effectively engaged and perhaps to ring the alarm bells as effectively and accurately as we can. So this is the challenge, and I think today's seminar and speakers and papers are going to be very much engaged on all different levels of contemporary anti-Semitism, and I look forward to the papers and to the discussions which will follow. So thank you for listening, and look forward to the day. You want to take 5 minutes for questions, 10 minutes for questions? Does anybody have any questions? Okay, Ursula.
My question is, or I want to make a comment, which I mentioned briefly to you. I feel that anti-Semitism is putrefying and actually killing the souls of those who are engaged in it. And there was this enormous indifference that many non-Jews, or I would go so far as to say most non-Jews, feel that it's up to Jews to eradicate anti-Semitism, and as a non-Jew, I believe that's impossible. It's like asking women to eradicate violence against them. It's a men's problem, or the violators. So I don't know, I would like to know how non-Jews can get involved in this struggle and recognize it as being to their advantage, ultimately.
So I think I would use the words of President Wade from Senegal and say that that there is a war on the Jews. And he said it very clearly and very simply. There's a war on the Jews. And that a war on the Jews is a war on humanity. And I think that anybody who cares about the state of humanity, who cares about human rights and human dignity, has to be engaged in the struggle of anti-Semitism. And I really believe that historically speaking, there's not an instance where I know where anti-Semitism, which begins with the Jews, ends with the Jews. And I think people who care about human dignity, notions of human rights, notions of some form of democracy, of some notion of citizenship, there's a responsibility to be engaged. And whether we're Jewish or not Jewish, it doesn't matter. I think it's a universal issue that needs to be dealt with at all sorts of levels, from the intellectual level to the political level to the activist level.
How to get that going is the big question. I have been racking my brain and whatnot for the last 30 years to get foot into a church of all kinds of denominations or groups, and I'm always referred to the local rabbi. So there is even among some of my friends, when I sent something, they said, well, I'm so glad that you are fighting for your people. And I had to point out, no, I wasn't fighting for Jews. I mean, I am, but that I wasn't Jewish. It wasn't my people. That it was for humanity. And it left them cold.
And I agree it's for humanity. I think that there's a tremendous silence. And when I speak about Iran and some of the issues of contemporary anti-Semitism, I'm amazed by the silence. It's extraordinarily disturbing. And I think that this conference at the end of April will be very interesting because we'll be looking at notions of denial and paralysis, why there's this paralysis in dealing with the issues. And I think that could be enlightening at an intellectual level. But having said that, at the same time, I think there are pockets of people who are very much engaged in the issue. I was in Berlin, and although I met policymakers that didn't want to hear, couldn't hear the issues, I met people, hundreds of people who are engaged and take this issue very seriously. This project, Aladdin, that was launched at UNESCO, we had 3,000 people, 90% of the people are Muslims from the Middle East, from parts of throughout Africa and Europe, engaged in trying to launch Holocaust education and fighting Holocaust denial, which I think interestingly, they see the rise of radical Islam coming particularly out of Iran as a real threat. And I think that the fact that Muslim leaders, and these were all leaders, religious, political, diplomatic leaders from throughout the Islamic world, were very much concerned about fighting Holocaust denial, is I think they were reality screaming out to Europe to wake up because this threat coming out of Iran is a threat against them as well. So I think there are things happening that are positive.
I wasn't aware of what happened at York University.
You were?
I was not.
Okay.
When was that?
It was about a month ago. It was at the beginning of anti-apartheid week, and it happened about a month ago. And interestingly, I was in Toronto. I spoke at Ryerson College, University of Toronto, and York University. And I was sitting at Ryerson University with the leaders of Hillel, of Ryerson. We were 5 students, a staff member of Hillel who was 22 or 23-year-old kid, and myself, and we were having breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning, having coffee and cereal and talking about issues of anti-Semitism. And the administrator who's in charge of student affairs came into the office, and she had received a complaint. Somebody heard that there was a meeting at Hillel about anti-Semitism, and she was coming in to see if everything was okay and we weren't planning any violence. So here we were, 8 o'clock in the morning. I was jet lagged, and the kids, I think, were half asleep from the party they were at the night before, and the chief administrator was coming in. So this is the environment in Toronto that kids are facing. That there's really, under the pretext and under the notion of anti-apartheid, and that the Israeli state is an apartheid state or a Nazi state, here you have middle-class Jewish Canadians being marginalized to the point where they're being monitored by the administration of the university for causing trouble. So it's I have to say that I grew up in Montreal, and I haven't been to Toronto for probably 20 odd years. And I think going to Toronto last month, it was almost a surreal dream. I did not recognize the country in which I grew up. Things are really shifting on the ground. And I was at Brown University. Harry's here, and at Brown University, another leading university in this country. Every time I mentioned anti-Semitism or the Holocaust, there was a chorus of students in the back hissing and shifting in their seats, because the Holocaust is a pretext to justify the apartheid state. This is at Brown University. So we have to become, I think, aware of what is happening on the ground. Things are moving, I would say, faster. This is almost like wildfire, and the winds are picking up. We have to react. How do we deal with it? And I think one of the ways that we need to deal with it as scholars is to put out material for intellectuals to consume, but I also think we need to put out material for students to have access to. I think the students don't have an answer. Students are not reading fatwa. Students don't understand the language of radicalism. Students are intimidated by leftists who are fighting for human rights, you know, as students ought to. They don't have the answers. And we need to wake people up and to educate people on this issue.
So as part of the Jewish community, or as part of the community, receiving this information, what do we do? What am I supposed to do when I leave here today and am completely understanding what you're saying? I hear what you're saying. What am I supposed to do with that information? How am I supposed to be active with that information?
I would say the first, I think education, knowledge is power. And I think, on the one hand, the scholars at YIISA were producing knowledge. And if we produce good knowledge, it's powerful. And I would argue that the community, the Jewish community, people who care about issues of human rights, citizenship, gay rights, women's rights, pluralism, etc., that we have to provide basic materials for students to understand, for policymakers to understand, and for scholars to understand. And I think if people begin to understand the complexities of this challenge, once we have an understanding, then we can start to develop solutions. I don't even think we have an understanding.
I'm Harry from Brown, and I have another answer. I think knowledge is extremely important, but also students who are active on campuses, to a large degree on many campuses in the United States, are going it alone. And they're the only voices on campuses. Faculty are not speaking out because they don't think it's their place to do, or they're intimidated by the other members of their faculty. And communities aren't supportive of enough of student activity, and alumni are not actively involved. So I think that in order for students to be as effective as possible and confront, today actually there was an apartheid wall on the update to the Brown story, but the pro-Palestinian group on the Brown campus constructed an apartheid wall. Students need help from professors, they need help from alumni, and they need help from the communities where they're situated. And that triangle hasn't coalesced yet. And I think that it's the missing link to being, for students to be as effective as possible.
I think to reiterate, yeah, you know, if I was a 19-year-old kid away from home for the first time, and my friends are telling me that I'm supporting an apartheid Nazi state, and I don't have the knowledge and the answers, I'll either run away or even join them. And yeah, and I would say, to be blunt, that I agree that faculty, you know, for whatever interest they have in their career and to be accepted among their colleagues, I think have sold out students and sold out a search for truth and to be engaged in the issues. And yeah, I think as a community of scholars, I think we've let down the students, and I think we've let down this issue.
So have you reached out to the community in Providence?
We're starting to do that right now. There's a divestment movement launched this semester, and we realized it's because of the way that Brown is institutionally, it's not going to be successful. But we realized that if that wasn't the case, that the student activist community would not have been capable to handle the response. We wouldn't have been able to defeat it. So we're right now in the process of building that relations with the community, with the Jewish Community Relations Council, with starting another pro-Israel alumni network, and a community among faculty who are willing to get involved.
Okay, so thanks. The time is short, so I think we should start the next panel, if that's okay. And I think that these issues and questions, I hope the dialogue in the breaks will continue to develop, and I hope I provided a little food for thought, and I know that the next papers will do that well. And so I hope this will create a discussion that we can actually, at a level of scholarship and perhaps a level of action, develop and hopefully implement as time goes on. So it is a privilege to call up Anat Boker and Ben Herzog, who will lead the first session. You want to the computer? Okay, so you know what? If you guys, we'll take a 3-minute break if you want to have drinks or coffee, help yourself, and then we're going to start the computer. Okay, so it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to introduce Annette and Ben. Annette is going to speak on anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, the Jew in the European historical imagination.
Oh, perfect.
Oh, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll do it proper.
Okay. You know?
So Annette has a BA and a master's magna cum laude in history from Tel Aviv University. She wrote her dissertation in the Department of History at Stanford University, where she specialized in modern Eastern European and Jewish history. The dissertation was entitled? The Zionist to Diane, the Anti-Zionist Campaign in Poland, 1967 and 1968, and is the first English language study on this issue, on this subject. So,
Good morning, everyone. So my talk today is anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, the place of the Jew in the European historical imagination of the Jew in Israel. In his controversial work, The Jewish Century, YIISA claimed that the modern age was the age of anti-Semitism. Nationalism was the religion, and every tribe had to have a state. Jews turned out to be the only European tribe without a state. As the world's economy became globalized and people and information traveled more easily, Jews also lost their special place in society as literate merchants and urban shopkeepers. The need for a network of people scattered throughout Europe that could engage in interstate trade and banking diminished to a great extent. According to Slesky, the 20th century's dominant ideologies, nationalism, communism, Nazism, sought to solve that new Jewish problem. The following paper begins with the supposition that the ideologies of the 20th century had indeed aspired to solve the Jewish predicament, but suggests a different view of the centrality of Jews in the European political imagination. That imagination was very much shaped by centuries of Christianity and the role the Jews played in Christian mythology and its eschatological drama. Since the birth of Christianity, Jews have been present in the European understanding of historical time and given a role to play at the beginning and the end of time. After the ostensible secularization of Europe, Jews continued to play a role in various imaginings of the end of time. In racist, nationalist, Nazi, and communist ideologies, the resolution of the Jewish problem was key to bringing paradise now. And in this paper, I will trace the perception of Jews in Christian civilization from the early Christians to the 20th century, showing both changes in perceptions about the place of Jews in Christian society and the persistence of certain trends in thinking about Jews. This presentation is neither an all-inclusive nor a conclusive history of anti-Semitism. Rather, it suggests a way to understand the endurance of anti-Jewish sentiments throughout European history. Christianity was the first non-Jewish civilization to award Jews a special place in its mythology and history. The Christian Gospels held the Jews responsible for Jesus' death on the cross. The crucifix itself symbolized the difference between Jews and Christians. The former rejected Jesus, while the latter accepted him as the Messiah. The new Christian faith was to replace the old Jewish one. When the Jews refused to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah, they lost their covenant with God, and Christians became the new chosen people. In some of the Gospels, Jesus was crucified around Passover, and according to tradition, this made him the Lamb of God. The Passover sacrifice, his crucifixion, was considered the moment of rebirth and redemption of his followers. In the words of one historian of early Christianity, the Jews had a particular role to play in a divinely ordained historical drama. His role stemmed from his failure to embrace Christianity when Jesus, his own kinsman, came to redeem him and his people before all others. The founding fathers of the Christian church characterized all Jews, not just those few who personally participated in the events around Jesus' death, as Christ figures. This understanding of Jews as perpetrators of deicide meant that Jews deserved whatever was inflicted upon them. God punished the formerly Jewish people. Their holy temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and they were forced to leave the promised land into eternal exile. One of the most important figures of Christian theology, St. Augustine, insisted that the Jews had killed Jesus, even if the Romans had actually put him to death. According to Augustine, the Jews' continued existence in exile and affliction was not only God's punishment, but also God's constant reminder to Christians of their special history. The previously chosen people were doomed to live side by side with those tied in a new covenant with God, forever confirming Christianity's triumph. The Jews played a particular role not only in the beginning of the Christian millennium, but also in the religion's vision of the end of time. Christianity, taking Judaic ideas, perceived history as moving along the timeline with a beginning and an end. In his epistle, Paul presented the Jewish faith as part of God's plan. Their rejection of Jesus led to the Gentiles' salvation, and the conversion of the Jews would lead to the final redemption, to the deliverance of all humanity, including the Jews. As aptly explained by Jeremy Cohen, Paul's words led to centuries of theological discussions on the place of Jews in this eschatological drama. Many, from Origen in the 3rd century on, stressed that the Jews were a necessary element in the end of days scenario. Their conversion would be a sign that the judgment day had or is or was about to come. Later scholars, including Augustine, claimed that only some of the Jews would be saved. In any case, the Jews' acceptance of Jesus was central to the second coming. Without some sort of Jewish conversion, the history of mankind, as seen by many Christian thinkers, could not end. This kind of interpretation also meant that Jews should be allowed to exist in the Christian world. Other interpreters of the New Testament stressed the interaction between the Antichrist and Jews, or between Jews and Satan. Part of the eschatological drama was the appearance of the Antichrist, a false prophet who would fool many until finally crushed by the Messiah, the returning Christ, and his army of believers. In some of the writings, Antichrist himself had Jewish roots or was born to Jewish parents. While in others, Jews just followed the Antichrist who adopted some sort of Jewish practices. Christian theology thus linked Jews with ultimate evil. These two ideas about the role of Jews at the end of days as both salvaged and evil people persisted throughout the Christian centuries. The Jews' position in Christian theology also shaped their social and political standing. As Europe Christianized, the political leaders depended on the church's support. Laws established Jews as the lowest caste, more or less excluded them from most professions, and banned them from owning large tracts of land. Following Augustine's prescription, Jews were to maintain their outcast and exiled existence. Periods of religious fervor and increased belief in the imminent coming of Armageddon also brought with them new waves of anti-Jewish violence and a growing push for Jewish conversion and expulsion. Historians point to the First Crusade as a time when attitudes to Jews in Europe changed for the worse, and the church increasingly demonized the Jews. A wave of anti-Jewish violence swept northern Europe as the crusading armies made their way to Palestine, and as religious fervor led many Europeans to attack the local infidels, the Jews. In the 12th and 14th century, Christian thinkers reconsidered the place of Jews in their society and moved away from the idea that Jews had to be protected. Friars and theologians came to see that Judaism had not ceased to develop in the centuries since the crucifixion, and the Jews were not serving as downtrodden witnesses to Christianity's triumph. Therefore, they no longer deserved the protection of the church. But if Jews failed to fulfill their special role in Christian prophecy, how would the promised end of days arrive? Forced conversion thus became acceptable. Jews had to be made by force to see the light. Throughout the 12th and 13th century, church officials banned the Talmud, burning copies of it, and going as far as putting it on trial. Local authorities introduced Jew badges that Jews were forced to wear as markers of difference and shame of being Christ-haters. Jews were expelled from Western European countries, from the lands of today's Germany, England, France, and Italy. But the most important case in point was the expulsion of Jews from Spain. In the 15th century, the Spanish Church and Crown came to believe that Spain had a special mission to spread Christianity and save the world from sin. However, how could a nation that was selected to lead the great millenary crusade still have unconverted Jews living among it? Spanish leaders rejected such a possibility. Jews had either to convert or leave. In 1492, the Catholic kings expelled all non-converted Jews from Spain. During the High Middle Ages, accusations of ritual murder and blood libels against Jews spread all over Europe. Lower clergy and laymen in various European towns accused Jews of murdering Jewish children, either to use their blood to make matzah, or as part of a cruel Passover ritual mandated by the religion's chief rabbis. Jews were also accused of host desecration, the attempt to destroy the Holy Bread. Those allegations led to waves of anti-Jewish violence and promoted the idea that Jews from around Europe conspired together against Christians. The logic of the supposed Jewish conspiracy was compelling. In the pre-Reformation age, Christians could not comprehend a religion like Judaism, in which there was no structured organization, no final authority on earth, not a clear hierarchy that would bring believers the word of God as sent down from the Pope. Catholics were united in a true church, organized in a very strict hierarchy. Therefore, Jews, they imagined, must have had a similar organization of their own, a secret and evil anti-church. The myth of the Jewish conspiracy needed no material proof for that. Following these expulsions and pogroms, Jews moved further east, settling either on the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or in the Ottoman Empire. In spite of anti-Jewish legislation based on religion and the occasional or more than occasional violence, Jews enjoyed relative prosperity there. In the 16th and 17th centuries were marked by the Reformation and religious wars over the future of Christianity and biblical truth. Many worried that the Antichrist was about to appear. The reformers of the German lands, Martin Luther and John Calvin, believed that Christians had to build God's city on earth and help bring salvation by themselves, without waiting for Jewish conversion. Such conversion was unnecessary. The fathers of the Reformation saw no room for Jews in this Christian world. According to their teachings, Jews were pure evil, and Jewish existence threatened Christianity. Since Luther adhered to biblical literalism, he rejected the 1,000-year history of Christian writing about Jews. If Christians were ever to cleanse themselves of corrupting influences, they must get rid of the Jews, by force if necessary, he believed. Jews would never see the light, as they have refused for centuries to recognize that Jesus is the Son of God. Luther further called on the German princes to persecute the Jews. On the Catholic side of Europe, the Counter-Reformation brought the Church to intensify its attacks on heretics and deniers, including, of course, the Jews. And in the case of Spain, this led to the strengthening of the Inquisition. A century later, as the religious fervor faded away, Jews began gradually to return to Western and Central Europe, to the lowlands, to some of the German principalities, to parts of France, and to England. Jews became visible again in most of Europe. Yet, as the continent secularized, patterns of thoughts and ways of describing the world persisted. Europeans continued to organize time as having a beginning and an end and as moving towards a goal. Since the Enlightenment and its drive for secularization, Europe looked for salvation of mankind, not in a remote prophetical future, but through human progress and history. The philosophers of the Enlightenment preached for man's redemption by his own deeds. During the Jacobin phase, the French revolutionaries even attempted to establish a secular republic based on radical ideology meant to liberate humanity by force. The Jews, according to some of the Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Voltaire, represented a primitive past. They were an ancient tribe that hung to an antiquated religion. To move forward, Jews had to assimilate into the progressive European society. And European society had to make such assimilation feasible. And so the revolution brought with it, the French Revolution brought with it, a dramatic change in the status of the Jews. They were gradually emancipated and awarded civil rights. In the 19th century, Europeans conceptualized new grand strategies to create paradise on earth. Some looked to nationalism, believing that if only every European people had its own piece of land with political sovereignty, everyone would be able to live in peace. Humanity would fulfill its goal when split into nation tribes. Jews remained, as mentioned before, the only tribe without a state, a stateless community that belonged to nowhere and spoiled the vision of a nationalist paradise on earth. Either ideologues found Darwinism, the theory of evolution, which provided a basis for imagining history as a continuous progress based on natural selection. Social Darwinists divided humanity into races and claimed that since the beginning of time, races had been competing over scarce resources, and that the strongest race would be the victorious one. The weakest one would disappear. Echoing Christian tradition, the social Darwinists focused on Jews as the group that had special evil characteristics and was therefore doomed to lose the fight for racial domination of civilization. In racial terminology, Jews became Semites, some mystical race that originated in the Middle East. Since conversion was not an option from a secularized and scientific perspective, the Aryan race could get rid of the Jews only by force. And there were many Europeans who looked to Marxism, an ideology that claimed to be based on science, not a natural but a social one. Marx described human history as moving through certain phases towards the final stage of communism, the end of any other forms of social and economical organization, and the necessary establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marxism was a system of thought rooted in an idea of history as a meaningful and purpose-oriented process determined to move in a specific direction and coming to an end with the victory of communism. Marx himself posited that Jews represented capitalism and money. They were the carriers of capitalism, social institutions that had to be overcome so that the liberation of man could be achieved. It is not surprising, therefore, that men like Wilhelm Marr moved from radicalism and Marxism to racism and anti-Semitism. If one scientific solution to man's bondage was failing and disappointing, one could turn to the other. Both movements were anti-clerical, so religious as enslaving humanity, and regarded Jews as a degenerative remnant of the past that had to disappear. As the Jews were in the past inextricable from the Christian conception of the end of time, so they were also key players in the eschatological dramas of the new ideologies as they entered the 20th century. Communism and Nazism saw human history as inevitably developing towards an Armageddon, a final war after which a totally new chapter would open for mankind and paradise would be achieved. But before salvation could come, the Jewish problem, the Jewish question, in quotes, must somehow be resolved. Its solution could not be postponed until the time of the Messiah, because it would hinder his coming. In the Nazi anti-Semitic imagination, the war against the Jews was nothing else than a war to salvage mankind. National Socialists believed that Jews were racially determined, an unhuman evil tribe that wanted to enslave the Aryan race and could not be converted or redeemed, only totally exterminated. Once National Socialism came to power in 1933 in Germany, Hitler began his murderous assault on the Jewish people. By the time the Allies conquered Berlin, the Nazis had murdered 6 million European Jews. In the years after the Second World War and following these tragic consequences, the Catholic Church began rethinking its teaching towards the Jews. Implicated in the Holocaust, the church leaders sought ways to improve relations with the Jews and lessen accusations of anti-Semitism. The process culminated in the Vatican II Declaration that severed the link between contemporary Jewry and Jesus' death. Living Jews were no more responsible for his crucifixion. The declaration also called for better interfaith relations. Of course, not every Catholic priest supported or supports this new approach to the Jews, but it is still in effect. More than anyone else, the Pope, John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, represented and embodied this new theology. Born and raised in Poland, Wojtyła had grown up among Jews and had witnessed the Holocaust. During his historical visit to Israel in 2000, he visited Yad Vashem and reunited with Jewish childhood friends. Although his legacy is not universally accepted in the Catholic world and many Catholics voice anti-Semitic views, the Polish Pope's efforts have greatly improved Jewish Catholic relations and made anti-Semitism unacceptable to the official church. Communism, of course, was not implicated, but rather vindicated by the Second World War. The communist views of the Jews still influences lefty European circles. For the Soviet communists who seized power in 1917, Jews were also equal. According to Soviet ideology, Jewry was not a nation, and therefore the Jews could not be subjected to the same kind of national policy as other peoples of the Soviet Union. Their identity was unclear. They were a priori suspected of promoting foreign ideas. Jews, to be accepted as equals by the Soviet regime, Jews had to completely and totally convert to communism. In the interwar period, Stalinist terror did not actually center on Jews, but rather on all party members. Eschatological anxieties consumed the Soviet party, and one had to prove that one was a true believer. After the war, Stalin's focus moved to the Jews. Perhaps they were hindering the arrival of true communism in the Soviet Union and all over Eastern Europe. In the late 40s and early 50s, prominent Jewish activists and intellectuals, frequently called cosmopolitans or Zionists, were purged from communist parties and sentenced to death or imprisonment throughout the communist bloc, except for Poland. In the Soviet Union, communist Yiddish poets, writers, and actors were executed as national deviants. Stalin's death and Khrushchev's reforms brought an end to the Red Terror and this concept of communist Zionism. But the battle against Zionism and alleged Jewish Zionists continued in various degrees in the Soviet bloc until the fall of communism in 1989. As a matter of fact, post-war anti-Zionism was originated in the Soviet bloc. After the Six-Day War in the Middle East, the USSR severed its ties with Israel, a move followed by all the Soviet satellites but Romania. In Poland and in a few other countries of the bloc, an anti-Zionist campaign followed. The official media portrayed the Israeli army as Nazis. Israel was accused of doing to the Arabs exactly what the Nazis had done to the Jews. The Jewish state became gradually delegitimized, and Israelis were blamed for utilizing the memory of the Holocaust for their own gain. The Holocaust was reconstructed as one war crime among many the Nazis had committed. This discourse that combined left-wing ideology, anti-Semitism, and a type of Holocaust denial or trivialization traveled from the Soviet bloc to Western Europe and has become influential in contemporary left circles. In my view, this anti-Semitism of the left is one of the dominant forces behind Jew-hated in Europe today. It is an anti-Semitic discourse that was not implicated by the horrors of the Holocaust, and still carries legitimacy. The proponents of this worldview simply cannot understand why the Jews refuse to adopt a socialist or globalist creed, dismantle their Jewish state, assimilate and disappear, leaving the world to live in peace.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ben Herzog. Ben is title of his paper is Anti-Semitism as an Academic Topic. Ben has a BA in Sociology and Political Science from Tel Aviv University. He also did a master's at Tel Aviv University in Sociology and graduated with distinction. He did another master's degree at Yale University and he was engaged in a PhD here in the Department of Sociology at Yale. His areas of interest is political sociology, notions of citizenship, immigration and refugees. His research for his doctorate is on a comparative study of notions of citizenship in Israel, Canada, and the United States. And he's a graduate fellow.
As Bassam mentioned in his talk, say that if you want to succeed in the United States, you need to make your freestyle, make your talk. So I'll try. I'm not sure how successful I will be. Okay. And again, I will start with an anecdote which has nothing to do with my talk, but I just heard it a few days ago. And there is this, I don't know if it's an imam or who exactly issued this saying, but there is some religious figure, the Muslim world actually issued a ban against drinking in Starbucks because he said that the logo of Starbucks is Melkat Esther, like Queen Esther, and this is the reason you're not a good Muslim, you not drink Starbucks. Of course, it's not true, it's not Melkat Esther, it's a mermaid, but anyway. As described in the mission statement of YIISA, the subject matter of anti-Semitism, like prejudice, more generally, is a long and impressive intellectual and research pedigree, which remains the topic of ongoing political importance and scholarly engagement. And in this talk, I'll try to make some observation on this research. Today I will try to present some of the special features of this research. I begin the presentation with some quantitative remark on the study of anti-Semitism, the amount of research and when it was done. Then I will discuss some of the qualitative elements of the study of anti-Semitism. And I will talk about three issues. One is the research on minorities, on the issues, or study of issues of minorities. Then I'll talk a bit briefly about anti-Semitism and modernity, and anti-Semitism in strong objectivity. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Both among the four centers, I think, both the Vidal Sassoon Center in Jerusalem and the Research Center and Research on Anti-Semitism Center in Berlin, both have extensive libraries with more than 40,000 manuscripts and books about anti-Semitism. So it will be very, very hard. The other centers don't have the library yet, so I can't talk about them. But so, although there are so many books on anti-Semitism, it's hard to quantify or say much about it. They range on many subtopics on anti-Semitism and contemporary anti-Semitism, historical roots, the relation with Zionism, with modernity, and so on and so forth. Some of the issue will be presented today. So instead of just talking about the 40,000 books, which I don't know about much, and I will try to illustrate the same, the study of anti-Semitism with the books Yale has. So I went to the library and checked the books on this subject, on anti-Semitism, and tried to see when they were published and what the changes were in this, in publishing books about anti-Semitism. Of course, it's a very incomplete research. I mean, the fact that Yale has a book, which is in the title says anti-Semitism, it doesn't mean that there aren't other books which talk about this issue. Of course, you cannot distinguish, it's hard to distinguish between, according to the title, between works, actually anti-Semitic works and work on anti-Semitism. It's hard to distinguish between works on Jews in general and works on anti-Semitism. So this is just an approximate, what I'll show is an approximation of the study of anti-Semitism. So, here, small graph. So in Yale, there are the 400, I think, and 14 books, which titled Anti-Semitism. Some have hyphens, some don't have a hyphen. But we can see that the trend is basically in the beginning of the time there are very little research on anti-Semitism. It's also because the term anti-Semitism was not just coined in the end of the 19th century. It's hard to talk, so people did not talk about anti-Semitism before, but anti-Jewish or used other terminology. And it basically started growing in the 70s. The change, and what I would like to argue is that it's very similar to trends that in other research in other minorities like homosexuals, African Americans, third world countries, that only in the 70s there is a rise in the study of minorities and the understanding of minorities, or the study of minorities is important for the study of society at all, at large. The only change, the only difference in anti-Semitism, of course, is the Holocaust and the study just after the Holocaust, when more and more people understood that it's an important issue. But this too declined soon afterwards. Of course, I cannot by this measure, I can say that the writing on anti-Semitism growed, but I can't really say how much is it compared to other disciplines or other issues of minorities. I think that the fact that there are only 4 centers for anti-Semitism actually is a good indicator that it's not enough, and it's not, it's still not an important issue in academia today. But what I would like to argue is my argument that although in qualitative measures, the study of anti-Semitism is not different than study of other minorities, in the difference in qualitative issue. So, as I said, it is similar to other studies of minorities, but the difference is qualitative. And the difference is that most studies on minorities, only at the end of the 20th century, people understood that studying minorities actually very relevant to the study of society as a whole. For example, to study apartheid or to study other injustices is not only a problem of those minorities, it's a problem of the whole society. what I would like to argue is that in anti-Semitism, there were scholars that actually argued it from the beginning. From the beginning of the 20th century, prominent scholars did connect the issue of anti-Semitism to modernity at large. It wasn't just the issue of Jews, it was understood by some as a problem of the whole society. For illustration, I will talk about several of those scholars, which general scholars, we talked about general theories, but included anti-Semitism in their study of modernity. I'm sure you can come up with more. I'm not an expert. I mean, I'm relatively new in this field, and I'm sure you can find more general scholars who talked about anti-Semitism. And this is a bit the list that we'll talk about. The first, I found out and wrote in actually in 1899, Durkheim. And Durkheim is considered one of the fathers of sociology, one of the most important figures in the field. And he had an analysis of French anti-Semitism. He did not, I don't think he said much novel or important other than, well, Jews are the scapegoats, and he rewrote existing, no, he didn't wrote new theories of anti-Semitism, but what he did, and I think it's important, he connected those theories with the study of modernity at large. So he said that the upsurge of anti-Semitism should be taken as a sign of the illness of the whole society. It's not a problem of the Jews. During the same time, Engels also argued that anti-Semitism is determined by it's economically determined phenomenon, and it's connected to capitalist modernization and the lack of Judaism or people to place Jews in the system. As you say, there's earlier Marxist anti-Semitism, or talk about the issue of anti-Semitism, but they couldn't use the word anti-Semitism because it was just coined in the end of the 19th century. Leon Trotsky would later also argue that socialism, once the Jewish problem will all be solved once socialism replaces capitalism. Of course, after the Holocaust, it was impossible to deny that anti-Semitism has a huge effect on the European history, on the eve of Hitler's downfall. Adorno and Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School actually issued a non-Marxist, deviated from the conventional Marxist understanding that anti-Semitism is connected to class struggle, but actually argued that it's connected to enlightenment in general, and there's a clear connection between Auschwitz and modernity itself. Sartre also, when he later on talked about his existentialist freedom, he talked about anti-Semitism as one of the characters that he used to describe this phenomenon. The issue, again, that I want to stress is that it doesn't matter that maybe they didn't issue a new theory on anti-Semitism, but the fact that they incorporated anti-Semitism to their general or universal theory. Afterwards, we know Hannah Arendt connected anti-Semitism with totalitarianism and imperialism, and the Jew is a symbol of declining nation state. And I think in the same manner, Zygmunt Bauman would argue that about modernity in general, it was a system that wanted to eliminate ambivalence, to eliminate randomness or ambiguity, and the Jews symbolized those, and in order to perfectionalize the social order of the modern nation state, Jews did not have a place. You need to visit the Jews. Again, I want to stress this point again, that even him explicitly said in the 2000 edition of Modernity and the Holocaust, he wrote that that he originally did not wish to explain the Holocaust. He did not wish to explain the Holocaust, but to better understand modernity. So the use of the study of anti-Semitism was a part of understanding bigger universal phenomena. Of course, one can argue that those people, those scholars have a hidden interest, whether they were Jews, whether they were anti-Semites themselves, and the fact that they talked about anti-Semitism is not sincere. As I said before, one also can argue that those theories are not new, they're not important for the study of anti-Semitism. But what I wanted to argue is that it doesn't matter why they chose this issue, but it matters that the fact that they connected this issue to larger modernity and to social order. As you mentioned about the President of Senegal, that only now we understand that the war against Jews, the war against humanity itself, I think this is what some scholars wanted to say exactly that assault against Jews is assault against humanity. Of course, well, the study of the notion of objectivity is huge or epistemological debate on what is objectivity in science. I don't want to get into much of that. I just want to refer to Weber, also a sociologist, that argued that the problem in objectivity is not the choosing of the problem or what are you going to study, but how you study it. So to be objective, a good scientific research needs to start from a real practical problem. In this sense, of course, the study of anti-Semitism, like we're done here today, should be considered objective. Nevertheless, we all know that, or felt that many research and scholarship that begin from the lives of people of color it's a bit mixed. Okay, I don't know. What? Okay. It's so big, I couldn't. The research that starts in the lives of people of color, minority, and feminists are usually devalued and even attacked. Of course, as I think we talked about in our seminar, that when you study anti-Semitism, only the mere choice of studying this subject, people say, well, you are biased, you are political, you are predisposed to favoritism. Even more if you're a Jew who studies those issues. So it's still not considered as objective. I would like to argue, take